Hey guys, Will Walker here. Today I'm going to show you how to build cornhole boards.
So start off by ripping a sheet of 1/2-inch plywood for the tops. I used birch. You can get 4 2-foot by 4-foot tops from one sheet. If you don't have a table saw, you can use a straight edge like a 4-foot level, clamp to the sheet and cut the plywood with a circular saw.
Okay, so the frames are going to be made out of 2x4s, and usually if I'm just making one set, I would cut all the frames with a circular saw and a speed square. But I've got to make 4 sets of boards, so I'm going to use the miter saw and a stop block. The long rails are going to be 47 3/4 and the short rails are going to be 20 3/4.
I like to cut my frame pieces 1/4 inch shorter than the plywood we just cut. You'll see why later. Use the joiner to make sure that one side of each of the frame pieces is really straight. This step isn't crucial. If you don't have a joiner, just be sure to pick really straight material when you're buying your lumber. Now I like to rip the 2x4s down to 3 inches and get rid of that rounded over edge that makes it look like a 2x4. This isn't necessary, I just think it looks nice. Now drill pocket holes in the frame pieces so you won't see any screws when you assemble everything. If you don't have a pocket hole jig, you could simply use a finish nailer or a brad gun, or just screw the top down from the face during assembly. Lay out the frame pieces for one of the boards. Make sure everything is square and laying flat. I like to hold everything in place with some clamps until I get it all fastened. Bore some 1/2-inch countersink holes with a Forstner bit to be filled later with some plugs. Be sure to drill some pilot holes before you screw everything together to avoid splitting the ends of the 2x4s. Now it's time to assemble the tops and the frames. Birch plywood has one good side and one not so good side, so be sure to put the pretty side down. That way it'll eventually be the show face when everything is put together. This is where that extra 1/4 inch comes into play. Put glue around all 4 edges of the plywood, then lay the frame down. Flush up one edge, clamp it down, and screw it down. I like to lay out all of my screws first to help me keep track of what I've fastened already. Be sure to set the clutch on your drill so the pocket screws don't go all the way through the top. Turn the board around and use the plywood to make sure the frame is square. Clamp it down, then finish putting your screws in. If you aren't using pocket hole screws, you would do this with the plywood on the top and nail or screw through the face. Set the boards aside, and while you're waiting for the glue to dry, make yourself some strong black tea and set it aside to cool. Now use your router and a flush trim bit to flush out the edges. If you don't have a router, disregard the step about making the frames 1/4 inch smaller than the tops and just make everything the same dimension. Now it's time to make the plugs for the countersinks you made earlier. I'm using a 1/2-inch plug cutter in my drill press and some white oak for the plugs. If you don't have a drill press or a plug cutter, you could just use some wooden dowels for plugs. Just be sure to use the right size Forstner bit for the countersink. I cut all the plugs loose with the bandsaw, but you can also pry them out with a flathead screwdriver. Go ahead and glue the plugs in and let them dry. Meanwhile, you can mark the center of the width of the boards and 9 inches down from the top. Use a compass to draw a 6-inch circle. Drill a starter hole and cut the rest out with the jigsaw. I use a cinder block to raise the back to the highest point is roughly 12 inches off the table. Cut a piece of 1x4 about 13 inches long to make a template for the legs. Rip it down to 3 inches and draw and cut a radius on the end. I use the bandsaw, but a jigsaw would work just as well. I clean up the cuts on the disc sander, but that's not totally necessary. Just make sure you do a good job on the cuts. Now, go back to the cornhole board and use the edge of the table or something to mark an angle on the leg. I use the miter gauge on the table saw with a piece of scrap clamped to the fence to prevent kickback. Again, you could use the jigsaw for this. You can find the center point of the radius you cut in the leg using a compass. Use a 3/8 inch bit to drill a hole for the hardware. You can also use a handheld drill for this, but I'm using my drill press with a square clamped to the table to make repeatable holes. Now, round over all the sharp edges on the legs. If you didn't have a router or a router table, you could simply use sandpaper to break the sharp edges. Now that the glue is dry in the plugs, you can use a flush cutting saw to clean them up. Clamp the legs to the boards and use the 3/8 inch drill bit to bore through the skirt of the boards using the holes you drilled in the legs to guide you. Use the tea you brewed earlier and slop it onto the boards and let it dry. A few days ahead of time, make yourself some rust in a bottle. I use white vinegar and add steel wool to it until it dissolves. You can also add some rusty nails or some old rusty tools. The tea will raise the grain, so do a light sanding, then apply your rust juice. It will oxidize the wood and make it look aged. While you're waiting for that to dry, make yourself some bags. Take some duck canvas and cut out 8 7-inch squares from one color and 8 from another. Make sure they're nice and flat, then sew them together a 1/2 inch from the edge along 3 sides. Go ahead and put another stitch 1/4 inch around the same 3 sides to reinforce it. Trim the bottom 2 corners and turn the bag inside out. Fill it with about 2 cups of corn. Take the open end and fold in the edges about 1/2 inch and use pins to hold it all in place. I also add pins lower to keep the corn down while I'm sewing the last side. Now add 2 coats of wipe-on poly, put it all back together, and you're done.
Alright guys, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. Please like and subscribe to my channel on YouTube for future videos. If you have any questions on how I did anything, go ahead and leave a comment in the comment section. And if you're looking for rules to Cornhole, I'll leave a link in the description. Until next time, I'm Will Walker with the William Walker Company.